every history book tells you the same story. April 1865, Appomattox. Robert E. Lee surrenders. The war ends. America begins to heal. That is the version they settled on. Clean, comfortable, final. But there is a detail that never made it into the textbooks. A detail so inconvenient, so quietly devastating, that it sat buried inside a government archive for 105 years. Not because it was classified, not because it was dangerous, but because someone, somewhere, made sure it never reached the right hands. Months after that surrender, Lee signed a document, a carefully worded, formally executed document addressed to the United States government. A document that represented the last shred of dignity a defeated general could offer to his conquerors. And that document vanished, not burned, not damaged, not lost in a flood or destroyed in a fire. It was received. It was handled by known individuals in known offices. And then it disappeared into the interior of a government building in Washington, D.C., where it would remain. Untouched, unread, unseen, until a single archivist in 1970 opened a box that no one had opened in a century. Lee was already 100 years dead by then. He died never knowing if anyone had even read his name on that paper. This is not a story about the Civil War. You already know that story. This is a story about what happens after the war ends, when the weapons are put down and the real instruments of power, paper, bureaucracy, silence, take over. This is a story about a man who believed he had saved himself, and a government that may have quietly decided otherwise. And it is a story about one question that history has never fully satisfactorily answered. Was it deliberate? The guns went silent in April 1865. The flags came down. Soldiers on both sides began the long walk home. But Robert E. Lee was not walking home to safety. He was walking into the most dangerous period of his life. Washington in the spring of 1865 was not a city in a mood for reconciliation. It was a city in mourning, in fury, in the kind of raw, unprocessed grief that follows massive collective trauma. Over 600,000 Americans were dead. Entire regions had been reduced to scorched farmland and collapsed infrastructure. And the men responsible for leading the rebellion, the generals, the politicians, the architects of secession, were still alive, still breathing, still walking the same country their decisions had nearly destroyed. The calls for punishment were not fringe positions. They were mainstream, powerful voices inside Congress. Men with real authority and real intent were arguing openly that surrender was not the same as absolution, that the leaders of the Confederacy had committed treason against the United States of America, and that treason carried a specific consequence under federal law. The consequence was death. Lee understood this with the same precision he had applied to every military decision of his career. He was a man who read terrain, who assessed risk, who planned for contingencies. And the terrain he was reading now was as dangerous as any battlefield he had ever crossed. He had no army behind him, no rank, no title, no institutional protection. The terms of surrender at Appomattox had paused the legal machinery, but they had not stopped it. He existed, under the strict reading of federal statute, as an enemy combatant who had not been formally pardoned. The United States government retained every legal right to move against him at any point. The only thing standing between Robert E. Lee and a federal treason indictment was political will, and that will was being tested and negotiated every single week in the halls of Congress. He had survived the war. He could not afford to lose the peace. The mechanism for survival existed. President Andrew Johnson had established a formal amnesty process, a structured path through which former Confederate officers could apply for restoration of their civil rights. The centerpiece of that process was the Amnesty Oath of Allegiance, a document, a sworn written declaration of loyalty to the United States Constitution, a formal on-the-record renunciation of the Confederacy and everything it had stood for. For most former soldiers, this was a formality. Sign, submit, move on. For Robert E. Lee, it was something else entirely. He was not most former soldiers. He was the commanding general of the Army of Northern Virginia. He was the face, the symbol, the embodiment of the Confederate cause to millions of Americans on both sides of the conflict. His name had been printed in newspapers across the world. His decisions had shaped the course of a 4-year war. And now he was being asked to put that same name at the bottom of a form that said, in plain legal language, "I was wrong, I submit, I swear allegiance to the government I spent 4 years fighting." The pride required to resist that would have been understandable. Many former Confederate officers did resist, quietly or openly, buying time, testing the political winds. Lee did not resist. He picked up the pen. June 1865. He completed the oath in his own handwriting. Careful, deliberate, the penmanship of a man who understood the weight of what he was signing. He swore to faithfully support, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. He renounced his Confederate allegiance. He placed his signature at the bottom of the form and made it official. Then he handed the document to Ulysses S. Grant, the same man who had accepted his sword at Appomattox just weeks earlier, the same man who had shown him a measure of dignity in defeat that not everyone in Washington believed he deserved. Grant would forward it to the appropriate authority. The appropriate authority was Secretary of State William Seward, and that is where the accepted version of history begins to fracture. William Seward received the oath. That much is not in dispute. The document was routed through proper channels from Grant's office to the State Department. It arrived. It was handled by real people in a real building. And then it stopped moving. Before we talk about what happened next, or rather, what did not happen next, you need to understand who William Seward was in the summer of 1865, because his biography is not incidental to this story. It is possibly the most important context in the entire investigation. On the night of April 14, 1865, the same night John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater, a co-conspirator named Lewis Powell carried out a separate, coordinated attack. He forced his way into Seward's home on Lafayette Square, fought past Seward's son and a State Department messenger, climbed the stairs to the bedroom where Seward lay bedridden from a serious carriage accident, and attacked him with a large knife. Powell slashed Seward's face. He cut his jaw. He nearly severed the carotid artery. Seward survived only because a metal splint he was wearing from the carriage accident partially deflected the blade. He was left permanently disfigured, his face reconstructed by the trauma, a visible reminder every single morning in the mirror of what the Confederate conspiracy had cost him personally. This is the man who, weeks later, received a formally sworn oath of allegiance from the general who had commanded the army, whose political allies had sent a man with a knife to his bedroom. Sit with that for a moment, because what happened next requires you to hold that context in your mind. The oath arrived at the State Department. It was not processed. It was not returned to Lee with an explanation. It was not flagged for review, escalated to the President, or acknowledged in any documented correspondence. There is no record of Seward acting on it. There is no record of a deliberate decision to reject it. There is no record of anything, just a silence so complete that it suggests either extraordinary negligence or extraordinary intent. Lee waited. Weeks passed, then months, then a year. No pardon arrived, no letter, no formal communication of any kind from the State Department or the executive branch regarding his oath or his legal status. He made quiet inquiries through intermediaries. Careful, indirect, the kind of approach a man takes when he understands the danger of being too visible. Nothing came back. He existed in suspension, not indicted, but never cleared, not a prisoner, but never formally welcomed back as a citizen. A man whose legal identity had been placed in the hands of the government and never returned. Here is the open loop that this investigation cannot yet close. Did Seward make a decision? Did he look at that document, read the name at the bottom, feel the scar tissue on his face, and quietly place it somewhere it would never be found? Did he make a choice, not to destroy it, which would have been too obvious, but simply to file it in a place where it would accomplish nothing? To let Lee's legal limbo continue as a kind of slow, invisible punishment? Or did a single overwhelmed clerk in a department processing thousands of documents per week drop one piece of paper into the wrong box and seal the fate of a historical figure through nothing more dramatic than distraction? We cannot answer that question yet, but keep it with you, because the answer, or the closest thing to an answer that history will allow, is coming. Lee died in October 1870, 5 years after signing that oath. 5 years of waiting for a government response that never came. He died as a man the United States had neither formally condemned nor formally welcomed back. Stateless, in the most precise legal sense of the word, his final act of submission had produced no result. His signature, his sworn loyalty, his surrender of pride, none of it had moved a single bureaucrat to act. Whether he suspected the oath had been buried, or whether he died believing it was simply lost in the machinery of a slow-moving government, no record confirms. He kept his silence. He always kept his silence. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., in a box that no one was looking for, his handwriting waited. 1970, 105 years after Lee pressed pen to paper, in the summer of 1865. The National Archives in Washington, D.C., holds the accumulated documentary weight of a nation. Every treaty, every order, every administrative record generated by the federal government across its entire history. It is not a small collection. It is, in practical terms, an enormous physical problem. Millions of documents, catalogued with varying degrees of care, stored in conditions that range from meticulous to barely managed. The Reconstruction-era State Department records fall toward the latter end of that spectrum. An archivist is working through a collection of boxes, uncatalogued, unindexed boxes from the post-Civil War period. This is not glamorous historical research. It is methodical, painstaking work, opening boxes, assessing contents, attempting to bring order to a filing system that the original filers apparently gave up on somewhere around 1867. The archivist opens a box. Inside, among the routine administrative sediment of a 19th-century government department, is a single document. It is in remarkable condition. The paper has not deteriorated beyond its age. The ink is still dark, still legible, showing no sign of the century that has passed over it. It has been sitting in this box, undisturbed, since someone placed it here, and the question of when, exactly, and by whose hand, is one the box cannot answer. The archivist reads the document. It is an Amnesty Oath of Allegiance, dated June 1865, signed at the bottom in careful, deliberate handwriting. Robert Edward Lee, complete, properly executed, never processed, never forwarded, never acknowledged by anyone in any official record for 105 years. Think carefully about what that discovery means. Not just emotionally, but historically. Every scholar who had written about Lee's post-war legal status had noted, as a matter of historical record, that he never formally applied for amnesty, that his citizenship was never restored during his lifetime, that he died outside the formal legal community of the nation he had surrendered to. Some historians had used this as evidence of his character, of an unrepentant defiance that he maintained until death. They were all working from incomplete information, not because the document had been destroyed, not because it had never existed, because it was in a box, in a room, in a building that everyone could find on a map. The discovery was reported. Scholars were contacted. The historical and legal implications began to reverberate through academic circles and eventually into the public record. And the question that had been waiting since 1865, the question about William Seward, about intent versus incompetence, about deliberate suppression versus bureaucratic failure, that question came roaring back with a force that a century of silence had only amplified. Because here is the problem with the filing error explanation. Filing errors get corrected. Routine audits, departmental reviews, the basic administrative maintenance of a functioning government. These processes exist precisely to catch documents that were misfiled. When Lee's intermediaries and inquiries in the late 1860s, Those inquiries should have prompted a search. When historians began researching Lee's post-war legal status in the decades after his death, the absence of any amnesty record should have triggered a formal investigation of State Department archives. None of that happened. For over a century, the document sat undisturbed, not because no one was looking in the general vicinity, but because no one was looking in that specific box, which means either the box was genuinely unknown, a true archival accident, the kind that happens when large institutions manage large quantities of paper across long periods of time, or the box was known by someone at some point and allowed to remain undisturbed. There is no smoking gun. There is no memo signed by Seward that says what you might expect a memo to say. History rarely provides that kind of direct evidence for its most uncomfortable possibilities. What history provides instead is a pattern, a document that should have been processed and wasn't, an inquiry that should have produced a result and didn't, a record that should have surfaced during a century of historical research and didn't. Pattern is not proof, but pattern is not nothing. In 1975, 5 years after the oath was discovered, President Gerald Ford signed legislation restoring Robert E. Lee's full citizenship of the United States, posthumously, 110 years after the oath was signed. Ford described it as an act of national reconciliation, a closing of an old wound. The legislation passed with minimal controversy, because by 1975, the wound in question was more historical than political, and the man it concerned had been dead for over a century. It cost nothing. It changed nothing that mattered in any practical sense. What it did was confirm, officially and on the federal record, what the archivist had already established 5 years earlier. Lee had complied. He had done what the law required. He had signed the document, surrendered his pride, and submitted in good faith to a legal process that was supposed to produce a result. The result never came, not because he failed to act, but because the government that received his action chose, or failed, to do anything with it. Whether the choice was Seward's, made in the quiet fury of a disfigured man staring at the signature of his enemy's general, or whether it was no choice at all, just the grinding, indifferent failure of an overwhelmed bureaucracy, that question remains open. The archive does not close it. The historical record does not close it. And the comfortable explanation that it was simply a mistake, an accident, nothing more sinister than a piece of paper in the wrong box, requires you to believe in a very long, very convenient accident. What does not remain open is the consequence. A man spent the final 5 years of his life waiting for a letter that had already been received. His last act of submission, the surrender that came after the surrender, the one that cost him more than Appomattox ever did, was sitting in a drawer the entire time. He never knew. The war ended in 1865. For Robert E. Lee, the verdict never came. Now you have the evidence, the oath, the silence, the century of nothing, the drawer. Which explanation makes more sense to you? And which detail, above all others, is the one that history still has not satisfactorily answered?